everyone a couple minutes to continue to join us. So I wondered if you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself. For those of you who are already in the room, if you could type in your name, your organization, and tell us which part of the province you're joining us from. That would be great.
Do you want me to put last names or just first?
So I'd also like to remind everyone that's joined us through the phone line to please mute your lines, and we can also mute your lines for you.
Participant lines muted.
So welcome to Brittany from the Sandy Hill Community Center in Ottawa. Looks like we've got people joining us from Peterborough, Hamilton, Toronto, Champlain East. Kim and Angie, are you guys in Cornwall? Nice to see people from Fred Victor, County of Wellington. Yes, Cornwall. Welcome to the east part of the province. Nice to see Giselle from Barrie. And it looks like we've got people right across the province in the southwest as well, in Sarnia, Chatham, and London, Ontario. So please continue to introduce yourselves, and we're just going to get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So those of you who have joined us in the past, you'll know that my name is Sheila Subramanian and that I'm a policy analyst here at the Canadian Mental Health Association's Ontario Division. I'll be your moderator for today. And before I introduce you to today's speakers, I'd just like to give you a quick tour of our webinar room. So first of all, you're already using the chat function. It's great that you're trying that out there. If you look just above that, you'll see that we've got 3 presenters joining us, and I'm going to be introducing them shortly. You'll see the slides that we're presenting to you in the middle of your screen, and then on the right, we'd like to share a little bit of information about the program. So if you'd like to, you're going to hear more about the Opening Doors program from CMHC Toronto. If at any time you'd like more information, you can contact Everdeen Francis. We will direct you to that information again at the end of the session. We have some web links that we'll also share to you later. And then if at any time you'd like to download the slides for today's presentation, you'll find them in the file share pod there, down on the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner of your screen. The first file there, Stories of Migration, are today's slides. So just as with our previous sessions, we have reserved at least 30 minutes at the end of the session for questions and answers. So please try to hold your questions for us. But we encourage you to make comments throughout the session if you'd like to, using the chat pod, just as you're using the chat pod right now. Great to see people are joining us from all over the province, really. It looks like we've got people from Kitchener, Fort Erie. Well, welcome to everyone. And it's my pleasure now to introduce you to today's 3 guest speakers, Jane, Maya, and Sujatha. All 3 are peer facilitators with CMHA Toronto's Opening Doors initiative. And I'll just tell you a little bit more about each of our speakers today. Jane has extensive experience working with youth, and she's been a peer facilitator for the past 2 years with CMHA Toronto. She also holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology. Maya has extensive experience working in the areas of equity, diversity, and inclusion in Ontario. She completed a degree in public health, obtaining a Bachelor's of Applied Science degree. And Sujatha holds a Bachelor of Arts degree and a diploma in French. Previously, she was an instructor in Sri Lanka and worked at an embassy as a press secretary. She now also holds a diploma in community social work from Canada. So welcome to all of you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
And I'd like to let all of our participants know that Jane, Sujatha, and Maya typically, when they do speak to audiences, they normally see people in front of them. So this is a little bit different for them, and I'd like to encourage you to give them a really warm welcome. And feel free to chat with us as the session goes to really make them feel like they can see the people in front of them. I'd also like to thank EENet for hosting the tech side of our webinar today. Thank you so much to Angela, who's keeping us going. So just as with our other sessions, we have a couple of goals for today's webinar. First of all, we'd like to introduce all of you to the Opening Doors initiative. But through stories today, we'd like to enhance your understanding of the complex relationship between migration and mental health, And we'd also like to emphasize the value of engaging people with lived experience in all of the work that we're doing right now to support refugees that are joining us. And I just noticed that we've just gotten a question of whether you will see today's speakers. There is a bit of a different format for today. For one thing, we are not going to be using webcams, and our speakers are also using aliases today. And they'll share a little bit about why that is in a couple of moments. Our session today is also going to focus entirely on lived experience and why that lived experience is a really important source of knowledge for the work that all of us do. So at this point, I'd like to ask all of you to tell us a little bit more about yourselves. So we have a couple of poll questions for you. The first, we'd like to know how many of you participated in our any of our previous webinars in this series. So that's great. It looks like over 80% of you actually participated in one of our previous sessions. And for those of you that are new to our series, welcome. We hope you'll join us for our last session, which is happening in May. And then we have one more question. We'd like to know how many of you have worked with refugee families or individuals in the past. And here it looks like the majority of you have worked with refugee individuals in the past. Some of you are not sure. That's a great thing to identify because of course we don't actually know all the time what people's migration status is or how people came to us when we are providing services. So I just also like to emphasize that for today's session, we're not solely focusing on the experiences of refugees. While two of our speakers do have refugee experience in their families and in their personal narratives, that's not the case for all of our speakers. And part of the reason for that is that we'd really like to share, I think, the diversity of experiences of migration and emphasize that all experiences of migration and settlement do have a relationship and a complex relationship with mental health. So I'd just like to note that that is also different about today's session. So those of you who've joined us in the past know that our series is based on the CMHA Ontario Framework for Advancing Equity in Mental Health. And you can actually download a copy of that document also in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where it says File Share. The second document is our framework document. And given that many of you were in our previous sessions, we're not going to go through the framework in detail during today's session, but we would like to just quickly review a couple of key concepts and establish some common language for our conversation. So first of all, mental health is the capacity for each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges we face. It's a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnections, and personal dignity. And this comes to us from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And we also use the two continuum model to talk about mental health in this series of webinars. And this is important to us because it captures two different dimensions that make up our mental health. So as you look on this diagram here, you see that there's two intersecting lines. That blue line that goes across the middle reflects the continuum of symptoms to no symptoms of a mental health condition. And on any given day, at any point in our lives, we will find ourselves somewhere on that continuum. And the same is true for that green line that goes through the middle of our screen. That line reflects the continuum from poor to positive mental health. And that is also a line along which we will always find ourselves, and that where we find ourselves on that line will fluctuate from day to day or even within a day, depending on what's happening in our lives at that moment or at that part of time. So the two important things that we like to flag about this model of mental health is that it emphasizes that it's possible to have a mental health condition and experience positive mental health. So those of us who work in the community mental health sector, we know very well that you can be living with a mental health condition like schizophrenia or depression and be doing extremely well. We also know that it's possible to experience poor mental health without a mental health condition. And this is something that I think all of us have experienced in our lives. So what are the factors that impact on our mental health? There are many different factors, of course, but the ones that we'd like to draw attention to during this series, and particularly because they're very important during the settlement process for refugees or other newcomers to Canada, are the social determinants of health. And these are the socioeconomic conditions that shape our lives. And there's three that have been identified as particularly significant when it comes to mental health. That is experiences of discrimination and violence, experiences of social exclusion, and poverty or access to economic resources. And I'd like you to think about these things as we hear some of the personal narratives that our speakers today are going to share with us. And here's just a little diagram that shares some of the additional social determinants of health that impact on our mental health. So it's my pleasure now to get started into our session, and I wondered if we could get started by asking Jane to tell us a little bit about the Opening Doors program.
Sure. First of all, I want to say thank you for having us. So the Opening Doors project is a public education program at CMHA Toronto. It's funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada that provides free workshops on anti-discrimination, migration, and mental health across Ontario. So what is unique about this project is that all the peer facilitators have lived experience with migration and resettlement, and also with mental health challenges at some point in their lifetime, which may or may not be associated with their experience of migration. So the workshops are provided for newcomer and mental health survivor communities, services, agencies, and institutions. So the project was launched in March of 2010 with three goals in mind, working towards mental health, equity, and diversity. And this is in order to strengthen mental health, anti-racism, and anti-discrimination literacy in Ontario communities, and also to cultivate more inclusive and welcoming environments for newcomers and refugees to really foster the participation of new immigrants with mental health issues.
So it sounds like the workshops are available to people all across the province.
Yes.
And have all of you traveled across the province in these roles?
For sure. Yesterday, we were in Napanee. So
oh, that's wonderful.
We traveled quite a bit.
Do we have anyone joining us from Napanee? Let us know in the chat box. And maybe we can get back to what I mentioned in our introduction, which is that we're not using a webcam and we're not using your real names today. I wondered if you could tell us, again, Jane, a little bit about why that is.
So we've opted not to be on webcam and to use aliases today in order to ensure our anonymity and also for confidentiality purposes.
Okay.
So at the beginning of each of our workshops, we usually have what we call a comfort agreement with our participants, where we really highlight the importance of confidentiality and respect, especially when folks are sharing their personal stories and lived experience. And since we will not have a comfort agreement with our viewers today, having our identities anonymous feels most comfortable. In addition, although there's been a commitment to mental health awareness, there's also a lot of stigma and discrimination, which means disclosing your mental health status still have negative impacts. So also I would like to say too that, these are personal stories which can be difficult to share, but they're also just one aspect of our lives that really don't define us entirely. So sharing our stories anonymously also, I think, limits some of these potential repercussions.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today to share these personal stories. So Maya, could you tell us a little bit about what you do as an Opening Doors peer facilitator?
Well, hi everyone. So let me just start off by briefly explaining what a peer facilitator is. So a peer facilitator is an individual that helps others through different situations by offering support and guidance. A big part of our role as peer facilitators is facilitating workshops on topics that include mental health, anti-racism, and migration to both service providers and service users as well. And those include immigrants and refugees. You might be thinking, what's different or special about our delivery method compared to other presenters? Well, for one, we tailor the workshops according to the audience and participants. So, for example, if we're delivering it to service providers that are settlement workers that work with immigrants, we cater to their needs. And vice versa, if we're delivering workshops to service users, so that could be parents or immigrants or ESL students, we tailor it according to that. Let me mention that the sole purpose of our workshops is not only to educate people. It's not a lecture. Rather, it's to have a discussion and facilitate conversations surrounding various topics. we've had occasions where service providers would come up to us and would express how they've enjoyed our workshops, because their initial thought was that we'd be standing up and delivering 2 hours while they just sat the entire time. But the discussion and the facilitation component is usually a breath of fresh air.
So why do you think, Maya, based on this experience, that it's important to include peers in the work that we do as service providers?
Okay. So when you look at many presentation and research work, a lot of numbers, statistics, and percentages are used to show the current state of, say, whatever you're talking about. For example, if there was a lecture, or I should say discussion on anti-racism in Canada, without a doubt, the presenter would mention that, say, about 55%, and by the way, that's a made-up number, of racialized communities face racism daily. What's unique about a peer facilitator is that we've gone through certain life experiences that help us relate to our work. So in terms of the Opening Doors project, we have lived experience of migration, resettlement. Some of us may have challenges with mental health and have dealt with discrimination and racism in our lives. We represent the numbers, the percentages, the statistics that research has used, and we give it life.
So Jane, is there anything else that we need to keep in mind about using lived experience in the work that we do?
For sure. I think while sharing lived experience contributes significantly to anti-stigma work, some points that are important to bear in mind are that, even though there may be many similarities and commonalities in lived experience, this cannot be used as a basis for making generalizations or assumptions, as each person's experience is unique and complex. I know I mentioned this before, but I would like to reiterate the fact that, lived experience with mental health or migration is just one aspect of a person's story, and that does not define them entirely, as we all have multiple identities that intersect and even interconnect to make our overall experience truly unique.
Sujatha, maybe then we can start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience? Could you tell us a bit about how and when you came to Ontario?
Hi everybody, nice meeting you via this webinar. I'm Sujatha. Let me share my story with you guys. It's really a very brief story, but I'm sure you want the essence of my story. I'm originally from Sri Lanka, and the people of my country lived under the shadow of gun for almost 30 years just because of the civil war. I witnessed people dying in front of my eyes due to indiscriminate bombing and shelling. And people who were close to my heart got killed for no reason. The community was terrorized in all fronts. We the people began to question the violence unleashed by all those who had power. The involvement on human rights, documentation, questioning, and exposing human rights violations and abuses by all the protagonists, and it created insecurity for those who participated. And this led to put our lives in peril. As a result of this, I was traumatized and I lived in constant fear. When this became unbearable for my safety of my family, we had to flee from my country to ensure the security of my family. Up until 2009, I have been to a couple of countries and ended up in Canada in 2009 just to give a quote-unquote normal life to my kids, anticipating that the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence.
How about you, Maya? How did your family come here?
Well, me and my family, we're from Somalia, and Somalia is a country in Eastern Africa. In the 1980s, a civil war erupted as a result of a regime resistance in the 1980s. So my parents were very fortunate enough to be able to flee to the neighboring country of the Middle East, more specifically the United Arab Emirates, which everyone just knows as Dubai. My parents were fortunate enough to go over there. And while they were there, me and all my siblings were born, and everyone had this idea back then of, a better life in the West, right, and trying to provide for their kids. Not saying that we didn't have a comfortable life back in the UAE, but my dad wanted us to have more opportunities and better opportunities in the future. So my dad's family, when they fled Somalia, they actually migrated to Canada. So they already lived here, they've settled. So it wasn't a question that we were going to just move over to Canada. So that was one of the reasons we came here. And yeah.
How about you, Jane? So I moved to Peterborough, Ontario, and I realized we have some folks from Peterborough here today, from Jamaica in 2007 as an international student to pursue post-secondary education. So I had traveled to Ontario many times as a child and a teenager. Actually, Mississauga, Ontario was like my second home because my maternal grandmother, my aunts, my uncles all resided there. So getting acceptance into a Canadian university with a part scholarship was a dream come true because not only did this mean better education and future career opportunities, but also the possibility of remaining in Canada permanently after my studies, which I found out was possible during my research. But most importantly to me, although my parents did not know this at the time, was envisioning the reality of a world where I could completely be myself. So at the time, I was struggling a lot with my sexual identity, being a lesbian in my home country, and because of all the LGBT rights movement in Canada and the passing of same-sex marriage in 2005, this meant hope for my own self-expression and complete happiness because I thought of all the possibilities and it felt really limitless.
Now, when we were developing this session, as participants registered, we asked them what they wanted to know about this topic. And something that was of interest to our participants was to learn more about some of the challenges that people face during the settlement period. I wondered if perhaps, Jane, we could start with you. What were some of the challenges that you faced when you first arrived here?
Okay, so as I mentioned, so even though I traveled to Canada before as a child, I only traveled in the summer holidays. And I also stayed in a very diverse neighborhood where my relatives lived. So moving to Peterborough was a completely different experience. I remember the first winter was so difficult to get through, and it really made me homesick and really affected my mood. It was also the first time that I became aware of my race and racism because in Jamaica it's a hegemonic society. So, you know, most of the folks are black. So we never really talked about race as much as other things like class and so on. So it became even more isolating when I came out as a lesbian in Canada, as I realized that the experience, for example, you know, for a white lesbian wasn't the same as it is for a black lesbian. So I occupied a position that felt both visible, both hyper-visible, I would say, and invisible at the same time. And this really affected my mental health because I didn't feel I fit in anywhere. So while I found support, some support in LGBTQ and Caribbean and African student groups on campus, I often felt like I couldn't be my whole self in either of those groups, and I really struggled to find a sense of community. After overcoming, you know, obstacles in my first year, the second year in 2008, most folks will remember it was the year of the recession, my dad, who was my main financial support, actually lost his job back home. So this really negatively impacted my financial situation, and I was working part-time jobs to help with my expenses while simultaneously like working hard at the same time to maintain good grades so as to not lose my scholarship. Simultaneously, there was also rumors at the time in my church in Jamaica, for which my father is a minister there, that caused a lot of tension between my parents. So this really affected my physical health and my mental health. You know, I was having frequent asthma attacks, I was losing weight and having hair loss, I wasn't sleeping well. I really needed a lot of help, but I was so scared to see a counselor because, you know, it was such a fear among international students that, you know, if you're in distress and you need to seek mental health support, that, you know, it would affect your chances to remain permanently in Canada. You know, however, when things really became, you know, super difficult, I went to see a school counselor since most of the services outside of campus did not accept UHIP upfront, which is the university insurance plan that's supposed to be a version of OHIP. So after my first session, the counselor said that I was having, you know, symptoms of depression and recommended medication and seeking support from a faith community. As you can imagine, you know, I didn't go back for a follow-up appointment because I felt really scared to take medication because of what I learned about the side effects. And I also hadn't been to church since I came out because, I felt like, I had two choices. I had to choose either between my sexuality or my spirituality. So, this made me feel really fragmented and lost, and I just really wanted to find ways to cope.
How about you, Sujatha? What were some of the challenges that you and your family faced when you first came?
Sure. When a new immigrant arrives, his or her primary concern is to find a job. I'm not an exception for this. I attended so many job fairs and was told by the employment agencies that my resume looks great and finding a job for me was not hard. I trusted the predicaments and I got encouraged and I started to look up for jobs. To my dismay, I encountered so many systemic challenges. Apparently, my age was a challenge. My race was a challenge. My educational certificates that I earned in Sri Lanka reduced just to white plain papers that has no value in terms of Canadian context. My spoken English with a thick accent was a challenge as well. Having faced all kinds of challenges, I became hopeless and started to doubt the decision that I made to migrate to Canada make any sense. My husband was also rejected by the employment market by saying that he was overqualified for certain positions.
Sounds like so many things to juggle all at the same time. And how about you, Maya? What were some of the challenges that you encountered when you came with your family?
Well, one thing that I forgot to mention in the previous response, I migrated to Canada in 1998, and I specifically remembered the month because it was in February. And when those airport doors at Pearson Airport opened and that winter wind hit my face, I mean, you can't forget that. It was like minus 30, I believe. And coming from 40-degree weather, I mean, that was a shock. So that was a bit of a challenge that I sort of had to get used to. But some other challenges that I went through is after a month upon our arrival, my dad actually moved back to the UAE. And the reason was it was really difficult for him to find a job while we were in Canada. So he went back to provide for his family. And that caused a family separation, which does have an effect when, first of all, we are a big family, and then it put all the responsibility on my mom. So that was a challenge. Secondly, language barrier. English isn't our mother tongue, and it wasn't our first language as well. So I mean, everything around you, I mean, we don't think about it now because we speak the language, but imagine going through basic everyday necessities without being able to speak the language, right? Going to the grocery store, being able to read street signs, navigating yourself when you're on the bus, being able to speak to the bus driver to know where your stop is. That's a big challenge. And for me and my family, that was a major barrier that we had to overcome. Secondly, culture shock. And when I say culture shock, it was those glances, those snickers that I would get because of my identity and the intersectionality of being a black Muslim female. And at such a young age, I mean, I came here when I was around 6.5 years old. So coming from a country where that wasn't something that people talked about, and I was just I was just Maya. My identity as a black person or as a Muslim wasn't really made visible to me. So at such a young age to know that I was different as a result, and that difference isn't a good thing, took a toll on me, right? Also fitting in school. I mean, let's be real, kids can be really cruel, and being different in school, kids were always asking questions, making, little smirks like, is that a towel on your head? Let's be real, that's not a towel on my head, right? And as a child, you start to wonder, why am I not like everybody else? And lastly, integrating into this new lifestyle, community is a big part, I think, in the resettlement process. And because I didn't fit in with my society or my community at that time, finding a community that I could relate with was very crucial.
Now, Jane, when you talked about the challenges, you mentioned that something inside you just wanted to cope with the challenges. So how did you cope with the challenges that you faced?
Well, how it all started for me was that I met a community organizer that referred me to a counselor at a peer-led organization that worked with women facing multiple barriers and challenges. She just happened to be a woman from the Caribbean and also a mother of a queer-identified daughter. So she was really supportive in my healing journey and connected me with a group specifically for Black queer youth. So I started to make friends that I felt could really understand some of the experiences that I had as a Black immigrant queer woman. She also connected me with a faith community in Toronto that was very welcoming and accepting of LGBTQ folks. So the services and sermons, really helped me to ground myself in my spirituality once more, and to work towards reconciling, my spirituality and my sexuality. So, I was reclaiming pieces of my fragmental self, kind of piece by piece. I also became involved in my community by participating in a summer-long queer arts project where I learned a lot of new art skills that really helped me in dealing with some of the mental health challenges I was having. I also made more friends and started to really build a sense of community, which I didn't have before. In terms of the health piece, I was able to access services, such as like primary health care and therapy at a women's community health center, which was so great because it felt safe and it was such a supportive and holistic environment for me. So, all of that really helped me to feel really empowered, and I started to give back to my community by, being a youth ambassador and going out into the community and, sharing my lived experiences with other youth and service providers.
So it sounds like lived experience was really important to you, and so you're giving back now by sharing your lived experience. That's very meaningful. How about you, Sujatha? How did you cope with the challenges that you faced?
As I told you earlier, we came to Canada in 2009. Up until 2012, none of us worked. I mean, my husband or myself. So we were really having lots of problems, issues with money. Arriving with 3 children at my age did really create many issues. I felt I had to somehow or other find a job and support my family. That's the only way I can slowly change the situation and give some hope to the children. We didn't want our children to affect our confusion and issues. Many people advised me to embark on studies that it can help me to find job. After so many years of stressful life, we arrived in Canada to give a normal life to our kids. Having that in mind, with tons of inhibitions and resistance, I made up my mind to become a backpack school goer. I decided to do a diploma in CSW, Community Social Work. And while I was doing the diploma, I was fortunate enough to find a student placement in a community center in Toronto. The staff and the volunteers at the community center helped me immensely to regain the hope and strength that I have lost over the period ever since I arrived in Canada. Meeting with women, service users, who also experience war in their respective countries, and hearing their stories constrained me to come to terms with a stark reality in my life. My sincere hard work and commitment led me to be employed at the same community center soon after I finished my placement.
And how about you, Maya? You talked about some of the challenges related to language and not fitting in.
When I quickly learned that language was going to be a big part of my life and that I needed to learn English quicker, that was my first thing. So I started watching a lot of television, which also included a little bit of Backstreet Boys and Spice Girls. And I should pay them a little tribute. I mean, they did help me a lot. And also having a lot of conversations with my siblings. And since I migrated at such a young age, it helped me. I was able to pick up the language very quickly. So that was one of the ways that I coped. Secondly, faith plays a big part in my life. So finding a community center that sort of shared a lot of struggles, I should say, experiences, and also similar faith, really helped me believe in myself again. So luckily, after a long time, I was able to find that community, and they really did help me believe in myself again, and they supported me in providing me with the resources I needed and reminded me that I had a lot to offer. And thirdly, staying positive. I mean, it's easier said than done. It wasn't always easy at times, but really staying positive helps you day by day, and it makes you believe that there's something better.
And the one thing that strikes me in all of your stories is just how incredibly resilient all three of you were through this process. So something that also has come through your stories, I think, which is so interesting, is the new awareness around your racialized identities. It's interesting that for all of you, this is not something that you would have reflected on before you came necessarily to Ontario. So, and that's something that the Opening Doors Project believes is important to raise awareness around. So Jane, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why Opening Doors focuses on racism and mental health discrimination work.
Okay. So first of all, I would say that we have this narrative that discrimination does not exist in Canada, but it is a myth that Canada is a land of equal opportunity without discrimination. So unfortunately, racialized people, newcomers, and people with mental health issues experience racism and discrimination in Canada. And racism is linked to xenophobia and other systems of discrimination. In fact, research shows that discrimination has negative effects on the mental wellness, not just of individuals, but also of communities. So additionally, people with mental health issues still experience stigma, as there's still strong negative attitudes and behaviors towards people with mental health issues, and or people who have experience with the mental health system, which really robs people of their humanity and prevents them from participating in communities. So it's really important to provide safer spaces for communities to have difficult conversations around racism and discrimination in order to educate, raise awareness, reduce stigma, and to, enhance the well-being of newcomers and communities of mental health survivors.
Now, Jane, you already talked a little bit about how your mental health was impacted through the settlement process and how your mental health also impacted on your experience of settlement. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit, Sujatha, about how mental health came into the picture for you.
Okay, as I mentioned before, I experienced so many challenges. I experienced racism, I experienced ageism, and my English with thick accent was a problem. So it was really so hard for me in the beginning of my settlement. I was extremely stressed out. I still remember the days vividly, how I suffered from sleepless nights because of the overall situation that my family was in. I feared that since I suffered from a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, because of the tragic events that unfolded in Sri Lanka, and now I anticipated that this situation was definitely going to impact my mental health again. In order to battle the situation, I started to do some self-care activities that really helped me in the past. I'm a great lover of gardening. I started to spend most of my time in the gardening, so I became really unpopular among my kids. They were complaining me that I am spending more time in the balcony than in the kitchen. So I did contain a garden in the balcony to divert my mind. And I am also someone who loves to connect with people. I would love to talk to people and share things, share my things and share things from them. So I started to connect with people as much as possible, and spending more time with my kids also helped me to kind of battle the situation that was really worrying me, upsetting me a lot during the early stage of my settlement.
How about you, Maya?
In the beginning, Sheila touched a little bit upon the social determinants of health and how that has a great impact on one's mental health. And for me, they were greatly impacted, which then had a direct correlation with my health. The continuous discrimination, racism, and silent negative glances were affecting my self-esteem and overall confidence. It got to the point where I would believe those glances and comments and internalize that I wasn't worthy.
So when we met to plan this session, and each of you shared these stories about how your mental health was impacted through this process, we also talked about how important recovery was for each of you, the concept of recovery in the process. I wonder if each of you could tell us a little bit about, first of all, what recovery means for you, and then what your own journey sort of looks like. So maybe, Maya, we can start with you.
Recovery is all in the journey to a better you. It's all about the small steps of coming together to make change. Recovery is a process. It's not an end point. I've come to accept that recovery is full of hills and valleys and that it's part of life. And for me, as I mentioned earlier throughout my story and my challenges, community played a huge role in my recovery because I was at a point where I've lost all my confidence and self-esteem, and I started to internalize everything that I was receiving and believing that I wasn't worthy. And they helped me realize that, yes, you are worthy. And it also helped me embrace my identity as a whole and everything that makes me who I am. And as a result of that, I started to become more involved in equity, inclusion, and diversity work anywhere, I mean, in my community as well as in my institution where I went to school, to give back and also let people know that, you know, it is okay, and to embrace the differences. Something that my old boss used to say was, I'm not different from you, but I'm different like you. And I live by that.
That's an interesting perspective. How about you, Sujatha?
For me, recovery is a personal journey, taking control of my life again. It is apparently a process of empowering you. I would say it's a personal journey. That doesn't mean that you can't ask help from the other people. You need help from the people who are around you, from your family, from the service providers. So during this process, you develop a positive identity outside being a person with mental illness and regain the hope that you have lost and thus finding a meaning in your life. We human beings, we have so many identities, but whenever we have issues with our mental health, the identity that you have with mental illness, I mean someone who is with mental illness, that always dominates our identity. So what I would like to share with the people, we have to kind of explore other identities as well, other positive identities as well. For example, when I had PTSD, I was a mom, I was a sister, I was a niece, I was an auntie. So I started to really develop my positive identities on those things. That really helped me a lot. And my recovery, to be honest, was without medication because I didn't see a doctor. My family believed that I was in a state of shock. By helping me, by doing things that I like, would help me to come out of my mental illness, I mean from post-traumatic stress disorder. So they helped me a lot and I recovered. It was a recovery without medication. But your medication can be part of your recovery. Medication should be a part of your recovery. That's what I feel. And you may wonder what helped me to recover. Using all the resources that was available around me. And my family supported me really immensely. My brothers, my husband, he has been an uncertified counselor for me ever since I met him. So it helped me a lot. He still counsels me. And I got the right support from my friends. I had a bunch of friends who were really helpful to me, who did everything to make me happy. And again, my gardening helped me a lot. And I stopped reading for a while when I got the PTSD. Then I started to read again. That also helped me a lot. Those are the things that really helped me to empower myself during the recovery journey without medication.
And how about you, Jane?
So just like Sujatha and Maya said, for me, recovery is a journey where I'm learning new ways of self-care that is unique to me. So in a sense, it is about self-discovery, in realizing my own strengths and resilience in dealing with challenges. So it's about finding and expanding those internal resources that really help to sustain me and helps me to really thrive. So, again, for me, it's so holistic, right? It's about not just my mental health, but my physical, my emotional, my spiritual, and my social health as well. And I think, as Maya was saying, understanding of the social determinants of health is so crucial when it comes to recovery. So I mentioned many things like for my physical health, having access to a community health center, especially not having OHIP, right, having UHIP was so helpful because I got that holistic care, from primary health care to seeking therapy, going to community support groups like youth groups that were very specific to my intersecting identities was so helpful. So those are the things I think that really helped me during my own recovery.
I think what's striking is that for each of you, recovery was a combination of both internal resources, the things that you brought to the process and things that you looked externally for as well, services or support from other people in your life. So before we get into our Q&A session, what's one thing that each of you would want service providers to do? The participants who are joining us today, many are from the mental health and addiction sector. Some are from settlements, some are from the other health service providers like hospital sector. We have people working within schools. What's one thing that you would want them to know when they provide services to newcomers or others? Why don't we start with you, Maya?
I know I've said this already a couple of times, but I have to mention it again. The first thing that comes to my mind is the social determinants of health. And improving that for the refugee and immigrant community will have a direct correlation to the improvement of their overall mental health outcomes. Let's talk a little bit about the healthy immigrant effect, which has found that the mental health of immigrants start to decline as their years in Canada increases. And factors for this decline include employment, housing, education, health, social interactions, and etc. One of the crucial social determinants of health is income, which is connected to many of the other determinants that I've mentioned. So as service providers, I urge you to continue fighting for more resources. And when I say resources, I'm referring to money, housing, employment opportunities. Having such resources available will provide a smooth settlement. I mean, we can't guarantee that it'll always be a smooth settlement process, but by providing these things, it'll play an essential part to good mental health.
How about you, Jane? So some of the things I would like to highlight to service providers would be, not to make assumptions about people based on their experiences or other experiences that may be similar. So, it's really important to really actively listen and ask questions that are appropriate instead of assuming. So I know that sometimes as service providers, you're limited with resources because of, different systems in place. However, I think validating someone's experience can really make a difference. So even if you can't find, a solution immediately, validation is super important. I found that made a significant difference for me in terms of services that worked because it made what I was experiencing real, not just to me, but to the others around me.
Sujatha, what's the one thing you would want service providers to bear in mind?
Well, I totally agree what Jane and Maya said. I would like to emphasize one thing. I would like to tell the service providers to focus more on empathy than on sympathy. When a newcomer arrives, he or she needs your empathy to start a new life in Canada. Having undergone so much, they come here with a hope that they can do well in their life. So I want you guys to be a little understanding, empathetic, and
that's a great concrete piece of feedback. So thank you all. At this point, I would love to welcome our participants to share their questions with us. There we go. So maybe while we're waiting for questions to come in from our participants, I'd love to ask all of you, what's one thing you've learned from being an Opening Doors Peer Facilitator? What's something that you've learned from traveling across the province? Is there anything that surprised you about what you found when you traveled? Sujatha, why don't you go ahead first?
Yeah, I really love the rich experience sometimes our participants share in our workshops. It really motivates us. It helps us to continue our work as peer facilitators.
I mean, for me, I love traveling. So, I mean, there are parts of Ontario that I've never heard of, and our project gives us the opportunity to not only facilitate workshops in certain areas, but I think we also, we see parts of Ontario that we, you know what I mean? I don't think we'd ever have another chance of, so I love that. And secondly, seeing people's responses to our workshops, and no matter whether they're service providers or service users or their education level, or whether they're even experts in mental health, someone always has a good response, and they leave our workshops learning something, which makes us feel really good about what we do. And it always drives us to work better and to always improve ourselves for the next workshop that comes up.
How about you, Jane? What's something that
Yeah,
you've
many
learned?
different things. Well, I learned the difference between wet cold and dry cold, which I realized in many of the places that I've been to, like like Thunder Bay, for example, that I thought was going to be super cold, which it was, but it was a different sense of cold from Toronto, which doesn't really get to your bones. It feels like very refreshing. So that's one thing. But in terms of the workshops, it's just really a great experience to continuously learn. I feel like there's never an end point to learning, and when you share and your story, and you hear for example, newcomers share their stories, it's such a validating experience overall, because people walk away feeling hopeful, and that there are tangible things that they can do. So I really enjoy that aspect of our work.
So we have a question from Assad. He asks, did you find a cultural generational gap within your family or between your family and the Backstreet Boys cultural culture? And how did you negotiate that? So Maya, I'm guessing this question is for you because you gave a shout out to the Backstreet Boys.
Hopefully someone sends them this link and I get to meet them. But besides that, definitely, I think there is a huge, not just for me, but I think with a lot of immigrant families, there's a huge generational gap. For me, because I did come here at such a young age, so when I learned English, what happened to me was that I forgot my mother tongue, right? And that started to affect communication with not just my immediate family, but my extended family as well. And because I started to adopt, quote unquote, the Canadian culture, right? Because as I said, I was trying to fit in, and there was a lot of those challenges that I was dealing with. It caused a huge gap between me and my family. So I wouldn't say there wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't like, okay, so can I listen to Backstreet Boys every day for an hour? And we didn't have that conversation. It just, after a couple of years, we started seeing the gap there. And it wasn't something that happened overnight. It's something that was gradually, happening. And as I got older, I started to rebuild that again. Because when you're younger, you really don't think about these things. All you're focused on is, okay, how do I fit in, and how do I, blend in, and, quote unquote, whatever that means, blending in. So I started to see a gap happen, but as I grew older...
between you and your parents?
Yes, me and my parents. And because my dad went overseas, he didn't really live with us, and we would see my dad, let's say, 3 times a year. And those would last for a month, right? So with my mom, I'm really close to her, but my dad, when you don't see someone for such a long time, and this has been going on, till today, I should say, right, that he works overseas and we're here. So that put a lot of strain on our relationship. And to this day, I mean, he'll always remember me when I was in grade 3, and a specific moment of that is stuck in his brain, right? And I'm like, Dad, like, I'm all grown up now. So, I mean, now it's much better, but definitely there was a gap.
Sujatha, I'm just curious, because you're a mother and you came here as a mom with, you said, 3 kids?
Yeah, 3 kids.
I wonder, how did you find that sort of, did you find that over time there was a bit of a distance that grew between you and your kids in terms of their interests and your ability to connect with them? And how did you sort of negotiate that relationship and the ways of that relationship?
That's a great question. I really find it hard at times with my children, because my children are fairly really grown up, and there is always clash of opinions. Sometimes I mishandle that. So the children always try to tell me, oh, Mom, this is not the way to you tell, because I don't know, out of my ignorance I mishandle them. And I had really so many challenges also with my kids in the beginning. They really settled in very fast, very quickly, I mean, but I couldn't do that. Though I have lived in various countries, and in the States, I lived in the States for a couple of years. But coming to Canada and settling in at my age with my children, and I could see the generational gap between me and my children. So it was really hard for me in the beginning. Now I think I am slowly adjusting and trying to come to terms with reality, accepting certain facts in my life.
I have to say that as someone who's a new mom, I'm starting to realize that parenting just in general, no matter whether you have any type of major life changes in your family as you're parenting, you just always have to be flexible and you're always having to learn. Even with an 18-month-old, I'm starting to learn that. So we have a comment and question from Kingston General Hospital. They say, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I work in a mental health team, but I'm also a member of a community settlement committee for a privately sponsored refugee family. They're still waiting for them to arrive. They plan to share this information with both of their teams so that everyone is aware of the issues that might arise. So, oh, that's nice. Thank you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have a question here for Sujatha. It has to do with your experience of PTSD, and this individual is wondering if you noticed that your kids also had any symptoms of PTSD, and how did you help them get past this and work towards better mental health if they experienced it?
Actually, when I developed PTSD in Sri Lanka, my son was really very small, wouldn't have any impact of my PTSD. He was actually trying to help me without knowing what I was up to. But after he came to Canada, from 2009, I could see the difference in my children's attitude, especially in the very beginning of our settlement. My oldest son, who was 17 years old, when both me and my husband were struggling to find job, it really had an impact on his mental health. He sounded as if he was really going in for depression. So we were really scared, and we took him to a counselor, and certain things we did for him to make him to feel happy. Those things really work. But I'm pretty sure that when a parent has issues with mental health, it always impacts your children in some way or the other way. In a mild form or in an intense form, I could see that with my children as well. My younger children were very small. They were really carefree, and they didn't know what we were undergoing. But my older son was really impacted by my work in Sri Lanka and by the struggle we had here. So he was the victim of my life. I will always share that. I love to share that with you. Now he's a big boy, and he's a big man now.
So it sounds like the settlement process here was equally impactful on him, but it also sounds like there's a positive impact of your mental health experience yourself, which is on your parenting, which is that you were watchful for how to support your son when you saw some things that he might need support with.
Exactly.
So we have a question from Alexandra. She says, validating the experiences of discrimination was mentioned as an important message for service providers. Could you share a bit about what it's like when this doesn't happen? What are the risks of harms that take place when service providers miss opportunities to acknowledge experience and impacts, the experiences and impacts of systemic violence? Jane, I wondered if you could take that question on.
So for sure. So some of the things that happen, and for me, I can speak from my experience, is that, you really start to internalize a lot of those, instances of, racism or other systemic violence that happens, and you start to blame yourself. And of course, that leads to so many other things affecting your mental health and other things as well. So for me, that's what happens. So I think it's always important when you validate that experience, you're saying that it's not, it's not just you as an individual, it's the society around you as well that contributes to a lot of these things happening. So I would say that's an important one effect of what can happen if you don't validate and acknowledge that experience.
Now, something that you shared in terms of your own access to services was the incredible value that you gained from seeking services from organizations that specialized in serving, say, Black women or queer-identified people. I wonder, in not all parts of the province this is possible. So do you have any thoughts about if a service provider is supporting someone who is marginalized in some capacity, whether it's by virtue of their racialized or sexualized identity or sexual identity? Do you have any thoughts about what they could do to support that person when there aren't necessarily any specialized services available?
I think if there are not specialized services available, I think, there's many different resources in terms of like online and so on and other communities, so there's options for that. But I also think acknowledging that, this would be a preferred service, but that's not possible, and acknowledging sort of, and being aware of your social location and how that impacts your service user. So I think that would be an important piece, because I do recognize that there are limitations in other parts of the province. When I was in Peterborough, there was no specialized service, right? So it is an opportunity to be in Toronto, I think, because there's so many more services. But I think the acknowledgement piece, I think, is a good place to start.
So actually, during our second webinar, which was focused on some hands-on suggestions on how to support refugee kids and youth, our two guest speakers, who were Dr. Priya Raju and Dr. Deborah Stein from the Hingsdale Crest, talked a lot about how to reflect on your own social location, exactly what you said. So I'd really encourage everyone to go back and look at that webinar and to consider some of their suggestions for how we can support people who are who share maybe some similarities with us, but also many differences. So I just at this time like to encourage everyone to complete our webinar evaluation survey. It won't take too long to complete, only about 5 minutes of your time. We do have the link posted up there on the screen for you, so if you just click on that, it'll take you there right now. But I also wanted to let you all know that we have quite a few participants who wanted to thank you for sharing your stories and for answering so candidly, responding to their questions. So here's a comment from Nelia. She says, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I will share with our teachers and all staff at the Hamilton Catholic School Board. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
And I'd just like to remind everyone that we are recording this session. We will be posting this on our webinar, on our webinar webpage. I'll be sharing that link with everyone who is registered for this session, so you'll receive an email. But you can also visit our webinar webpage at www.ontario.cmha.ca/refugeemh. And type that into the chat pod so everyone can access the webinar. Another thank you from Salama, who says, thank you so much from the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture in Toronto. So it looks like we have no more questions at that time. I'd just like to give each of you an opportunity. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our participants at this time? Any final thoughts?
Well, I'd like to just, I think, thank you all for taking the time out to join us today. And thank you for the work that you do in any capacity, right? Because I see all of you are service providers, whether it's working with immigrants and refugees directly, or whatever the case may be, but I'd like to thank you for the work that you do and the people that you serve, and continue doing the great work that you do. And yep.
How about you, Jane?
Yeah.
Any last thoughts? Apart from thank you so much, I would like to say too, I think sometimes as service providers as well, when there's service users and we cannot always relate to their experiences, we could get really frantic and not know what to do. But I think sometimes remembering that, it's okay to ask questions as well. Like it's as simple as, what do you need? How can I support you best? Is really, really important. And I think sometimes it can be easy to forget that because we hold a position of authority, and sometimes we think, I have to fix it, I have to know best. But again, centralizing that person's experience and recognizing that they're the expert of their own lives. And most often than not, people know what they need. They just need help, support in getting what they need. So I think that's an important reminder. So thank you again, everybody. This was great. Thank you.
Great piece of advice. How about you, Sujatha? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for being part of this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you so much from the Opening Doors Project.
So I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like more information or to book a workshop with Opening Doors, the information for the contact person, Everdeen Francis, is there on the left-hand side of your screen. So you can contact Everdeen Francis. She's the project coordinator, and her email address and phone number is there. And one final comment I'd just like to read out from Lauren. She says, thanks to Maya, Jane, and Sujatha for sharing your stories and thoughts. You're all brave and resilient women. Thank you. And I'd have to
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to add my thanks to all of our participants. Thanks to the three of you for spending your time and being so generous and sharing your lived experience and expertise with all of us here today. I'd also like to thank Angela from EENet for making sure that our webinar came off without a hitch. Thank you so much, Angela. And I'd like to thank all of you wonderful participants for listening in so thoughtfully and for your great questions. We will be posting this webinar on that webpage that I've just linked to there in the chat pod. So please go ahead and check out the previous two archived webinars. We'll probably be posting this session within the next couple of weeks. And I'd like to remind everyone at this time that we do have a final session happening on May 12th. And I'll be sending out information to all of you about that session. If you're not already registered, please get on the wait list, and we will open up some spots as the time gets closer. So thanks again to everyone, and don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. And thank you, Sheila.
Oh, you're welcome.